Hello, we're doing this video today for the Teacher Fellowship of the Historical Association. I'd like to introduce ourselves. So my name's Adrian Bell and I'm part of the team on the People of 1381 project, and introduce my colleague, Professor Anne Curry.
Hello, I'm Anne Curry. Great to see everybody. And I'm also involved in the People of 1381 project. But I should say right from the start that Adrian and I worked together initially on the soldier in later medieval England database, which I think is relevant, Adrian, to the People of 1381, as we're going to see.
Yeah. So one of the reasons we started the project indeed, Anne, was because we felt there's such a military aspect
Absolutely.
to the revolt, and we'll talk probably a little bit about that today. So anyway, I'm going to ask some questions, and Anne's going to answer. So first of all, I'd like to say, how has the approach to the Peasants' Revolt changed over time?
Well, I think if you take the time itself, obviously it gets into all the chronicles, because it's not every day that thousands, even hundreds of peasants march on London and meet with the king. As time goes on, I think you get a rather romantic feeling about it too, and of course it gets taken up by early socialist writers. So in 1909, for instance, Joseph Clayton published a biography of Wat Tyler in the first volume in English Revolutionary Leaders series, and he compared Wat Tyler to an early trade union leader in the early 20th century. Of course, it's when trade unions were first developing. And then from that developed a strong Marxist interpretation. This is a sort of rebellion of the people that is going to lead to major social change, a sort of a revolution as time goes on. But that's quite interesting, because Rodney Hilton, who was the main Marxist historian putting forward that view, wrote a very good book, Bondmen Made Free, which I'd recommend to people. And he's written this whole book about the Peasants' Revolt, essentially. And then at the end of it, of course, he says, of course, in terms of historical change, it isn't going to be the land-locked peasantry, the labourers who work on the land, who are the agents of social change. It's got to be the proletariat, the industrial workers, who are going to lead into this, because he's very much following Marx's idea of how change would occur. So in a way, the peasants get pushed out a little bit in this Marxist interpretation.
No, that's, and I think history-wise, looking at it, it's seen as a singular thing that happens, the Peasants' Revolt. But do you think it is unique, or what is unique about 1381?
I think it is unique. I mean, I've spent a lot of time looking at late medieval England, particularly the 15th century, and the problems with the wars in France. I think there's nothing else like it. There's no popular rebellion that covers so many parts of England, or where you have this huge march on London from all different parts of England as well. Okay, there's Cade's Rebellion in 1450, but that's very much a monocausal march on London to do with failure in the war in France, and it tries to attack those who advised the king badly in terms of war policy. Whereas I think in 1381 you've got lots of different protests going along, and in fact lots of different complaints being put forward. The most obvious is an end to villanage, but there are other things coming in, like a dislike of John of Gaunt, religious factors as well. So I think the multi-causal as well as the multi-geographic nature of 1381 really makes it unique. And I think the meetings with the king as well are pretty special.
And a lot of what we know as a narrative comes from the Chronicles. And I know myself and you have spoken tried to work outside the Chronicles with our work on the 100 Years' War. I mean, famously, you said to me, famously between me and you, that Froissart wrote his chronicles, a famous chronicle, 100 years in his bedroom, so that's without noticing.
Well, they're more novels than chronicles, and I think we shouldn't take what they say at face value. Of course, most people would have been, grown up with Barry Dobson's collection of sources published in English in 1970, and that was really quite a breakthrough, because it made accessible sources in Latin and French to a wide audience for the first time. But chronicles are written for a purpose. All of the chroniclers had access to ground of one sort or another, or particular views to put forward. Very interesting that Froissart, who was not well informed about the rebellion, after all, he's in France at the time writing about it, said it was all to do with the ease and riches that the peasants were of. It was rather like a kind of Daily Telegraph interpretation of the Peasants' Revolt.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting for us to think about chronicles in that sense, where we wouldn't we would contest what the newspapers say, wouldn't we?
I think we would,
Yeah.
and we'd look at different versions and also get behind who is writing it, who are these people, when were they writing, as well, and also beware of their love for little stories like Knighton commenting on the girls' skirts being lifted up to see whether they're old enough to pay the poll tax, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's the sort of gossip and sensationalism that is very similar to modern day newspapers.
And there's the one about, remember the one about the Flemish, is it the Flemish wives being allowed to execute directly, actually using the axes themselves?
Yes, it's they love a good story. Now that's great for getting us into the mindset of the period, but it's not that good for telling us what happened in 1381.
So that leads me nicely to say, so what can we use to tell us what happened? So what are the sources that are available to us?
Throughout my career, I've just been astonished by how many governmental records there are. I mean, my work on the armies, on Agincourt's based on financial records, but the legal records of this period are phenomenal. England was a terrifically bureaucratic state, and whether it was good law, maybe that's difficult to say, but there was a lot of it, a lot of levels of courts. And so after the revolt, we have special commissions set up to investigate those who've been involved in the revolt, and we have a vast amount of legal evidence, and therefore we've got names of people, of places, we've got accusations of what they did, where people are executed, we have records of what property they owned and that kind of thing. So we've got a really full picture. But of course it isn't just the hang 'em and flog 'em aspect of the Peasants' Revolt, because actually one very valuable source are pardons. The Parliament that met after the revolt, met in November 1381, actually was minded towards reconciliation. And so although some people are singled out for exemption from a general pardon, they're supposedly the ones involved in the murder of Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, a lot of people were given pardons for involvement in the revolt, and that continues, that goes on there. But also the Parliament said, if things aren't reformed, there will be another revolt. So they were quite well aware of the difficulties at the time and the need for some reform. And although we know villenage was abolished during the revolt, Richard II issued letters of manumission to rebels from certain counties, and then in the Parliament those were rescinded because it was said they were given under pressure, under coercion, and the king therefore they were annulled. Nonetheless, studies of manners in the century after 1381 has shown that villenage does wither away. I think that's the expression that Rodney Hilton used, which is, I think, a good one to use. It didn't end at one moment in time, but it withered away.
And I suppose just to go back to the legal sources, those are the things we've captured on our database. In a sense,
absolutely.
I make sort of jokingly say we're using a big data approach to interpret history. So how do you see, are we gaining extra insights from this big data and how it compares, let's say, to the soldiers, for instance?
Yeah, well, as a historian, I'm very much a completist, I think, and that's what we tried with the soldier thing as well. It strikes me if you can put in as much data as possible, like as many cases of involvement in the revolt as possible, you're going to see some important trends coming out of it. And without having too many spoilers, I think we're seeing that the clergy are perhaps more significant, and also that there are more, the geographical dispersal of cases is much greater. And if we can then flesh out the biographies of some of these people who are involved in the revolt, and this is where Herbert Iden's work in the manorial sources in Essex is particularly valuable. Isn't it great? We can see how old were some of these people who came to London. Were they married? Had they been important officials within their manor? Were they to go on to be important officials after 1381? I.e., okay, they were involved in the revolt, but clearly they're pardoned or they're not prosecuted, and they still are significant as years go on. And women, that's another thing we've been able to have a look at too. So I think it is using this sort of approach and also putting it into a database You can come out with some statistical results of that, but you can also, I think, open it up to the general public, and people are out there researching families or places, so there's a sort of community interest in the project as well. And I hope from a teaching point of view it'll be a great resource that students can be invited to go and have a look at things on it and come to their own conclusions really on the legal materials.
Yeah, I think we're really hopeful for that indeed. And then just to sort of draw this little mini interview to a close, what does the revolt tell us about the nature of society and life in 1381?
Well, I think going back to what I said earlier, I think it shows the sophistication, and I don't just mean the sophistication of the English legal system, but the sophistication of peasant protest, if you like. You know, people knew what was going on, and they're coming up with some very, very sensible criticisms of the government, and in that they're in line with the good Parliament of 1376, where the MPs had started criticising the government for spending funds badly, and that's the Parliament where we first have a speaker introduced into the Parliament. So it's part of a sort of widespread crisis of confidence in government, and I think what we see about popular politics, if you like, is very valuable there. But again, back to the bureaucracy, I think this is truly remarkable. It's not unique to England. I mean, we know that the Low Countries and France, some pretty good sources there, but that we can recapture all of this information into what happened on individual days where people moved from and to and that kind of thing is really remarkable. And adding in something about the people, particularly linking it to our soldier database, how many of the people in the revolt had served in the wars before this point, and also linking it to the poll tax, which of course is particularly valuable because the tax is something that the peasants were protesting about.
All right. I think that's told us a lot today in a very short amount of time. Well, thank you very much, Anne.